Hello. Today I would like to discuss the country of Algeria, which is in Africa. The pre-colonial and post-colonial period is what we will be discussing today. So let me share my screen here. So, Algeria, this is the history of this African nation. It's a unique history in many ways. So Algeria has a long and rich history, and one of that is heavily intertwined with the French colonial rule, which we will discuss later. But so let's start it from the beginning, and then we'll see how the French colonial rule develops in Algeria. So on Friday, August 26, 1881, the French government, led by arch-colonialist Jules Ferry, announced a monumental step to the National Assembly. Algeria would be a part of the administration, and it would be an integral part of France under the Third Republic's 1875 constitution. And this is kind of how the colonial period begins. And in Africa, most colonialism was at the hands of British, French powers. Also, we do have some Belgian influence, Italian influence in Libya, so on and so forth. But in the case of Algeria, it was French influence. And each colonial power took a different approach. Algeria, there was more hands-on approach to colonialism. There were settlers that settled in Algiers that came from France, while British by and large were less hands-on. There wasn't settlers as much as in the case of Algeria and as assimilated as Algeria, so on and so forth. And Algeria also uniquely, these colonies in Africa, the French language is exported, while not so much the case of the British imperial rule in Africa. So there are two conflicts in the 20th century. So let's zoom. At the dawn of the 20th century, Algeria was a country ravaged by two conflicts. And there's also the colonial conflicts and a conflict that the civil war in 1992 that we will discuss later. And a lot of that fragmentation, political fragmentation, was as a result of a lot of the colonial policies and also other things. But colonialism did play a pretty big role in later conflicts in the country, and how many would say Algeria in the 90s was a failed state, even though now it's a little more stable, and we'll discuss that later as well. So at the dawn of the 20th century, Algeria was a country ravaged by two main conflicts. The first conflict took place in the country's colonial period, and it was Algeria's famous war with France, which took place between 1954 and 1962, and its purpose was emancipation from colonial domination. And the second conflict, as I mentioned, was the civil war, actually, between Islamist parties and the state in 1992, and we'll talk about the origins of that war later, because it's a very interesting war, and I think unique in that sense. So there's a struggle of social cohesion in Algeria overall in its history in the pre-colonial, post-colonial period. A lot of the struggle of social cohesion can be attributed to colonialism, and that is part of the African experience is a lack of social cohesion, and often it does come at the hands of colonialism, and we'll discuss that later as well. So Algeria, like many African nations in the pre-colonial and post-colonial periods, respectively, struggled with social cohesion. And as early as the 19th century, Algeria did not conceive of itself as a space unified socially, economic, or even culturally, and this paved the way for French colonial rule. And then so here is a little bit about Algeria's history and its colonial history for that matter, when the French get involved. On May 16th, 1930, a fleet of 500 French ships headed from Toulon to Algiers, bringing with them the mentality of colonial domination. De Bourmont's army landed on June 14th, only a few hundred meters from the peninsula of Sidi Farouch, and the fort protecting the beautiful city of Algiers finally fell, and the French conquest of Algeria began during this time frame or summer. After the surrender of the Algiers authorities, when the authorities finally surrendered, the French military held effective power, but was divided on what to do. So during the French colonial experience in Algeria, the French army faced strong resistance, and a very unique strong resistance. And within the country, religious sects called for a holy war. From 1830 until 1870, the French colonial army conducted a policy to eliminate traditional economic and political ties, which is a common colonial arrangement in African countries. And this, like I said, affects the political sphere. It also affects the economic sphere, and overall affects the social cohesion of an African state or would-be African state, so on and so forth. So colonization and its link with agriculture is crucial in this context. Algeria's economic future at this time was almost entirely based on agriculture. Colonization and agriculture became one in French Algeria. So this one's very important, this next point, and it's a common theme in our classroom. The institution of private property was unknown in Algeria before the arrival of Europeans. There was only a complicated hierarchy of rights of use. These rights were devolving in the Ottoman period into two major categories of statutes: the rights of the Dey, which is the ruler of Algeria, Tripoli, and Tunis, in his capacity as sovereign, and the rights of the tribes. So, after the conquest, the French state, as successor to the rights of sovereignty, seized the land of the Dey that we just mentioned, divided them, and distributed them to the French colonies. This is obviously a recipe for trouble, and a lot of similar things happened throughout Africa in the pre-colonial period, before the post-colonial. The colonization of land, coupled with the colonization of agriculture, led to an erosion of the basic fabrics of Algerian society, and this paved the way for French colonial rule and dominance. The modern agricultural sector was concentrated in the most favorable region, the Tal, where 98% of lands were expropriated. So this causes problems. And there's other colonial disruptions that I would like to discuss. The application of French law regarding private ownership was accompanied by a program breaking up the major tribes. This is, again, a common theme in colonial Africa. There's a breaking up of the tribes. Private ownership laws disrupts the common fabrics in that society, leading to political fragmentation, leading to a decay of social cohesion, so on and so forth. The destruction of these tribal units and of their leaders and powers had severe consequences, several of them, and it created power vacuums in the country that are bound to create unrest in the future and provide the groundwork for the creation of a failed state. And this is a framework that is all too common in African colonial history, as I mentioned before. So, colonial disarray. The fundamental economic disruptions unveiled in Algeria were not the only source of colonial disarray from the French had to offer to the Algerians. The local Algerian Muslim population and the French minorities often clash. And this demonstrates to us that the French took a more hands-on approach, as I mentioned before, and an interactive approach as opposed to the British counterparts. Despite this colonial domination, a whole series of religious sects, which had organized society before the arrival of the French, provided a counterweight to colonial power. So that's very interesting and important to note. More on this colonial problem. Okay, so the peasantry's participation in a new urban world came about through the intermediation of religious associations and new forms of organizations within the traditional religious framework. Algeria remained linked to the rest of the Arab Islamic world thanks to an uninterrupted stream of newspapers, books, and journals. So that's very interesting to know. So settler colonialism, this is not unique, but this is a big part of Algeria's history. So between the end of World War I and the first gunshots in 1954, the sense of belonging to a country, Algeria, took root among the French Algerian settlers. And this is something that is demonstrated in the film The Battle of Algiers. And the European population, in fact, grew from 833,000 in 1926 to 984,000 in 1954. And after World War I, the organization of French Algeria became more pronounced. So the colons obtained large loans to finance major public works projects with irrigation of settled areas and modernization of railroads, receiving the lion's share. The consequence of colonial policy was to concentrate the lands in the hands of a few small colons, so a few small people. And the mechanization of agriculture left the smaller colons indebted to the banks. Artisans were ruined and massive unemployment ensued among Algerians who were forced to seek exile in France. And there are a lot of Algerians in France. a lot, part and parcel because of some of these policies, these colonial policies. So let's dive deeper into the French-Algerian War. The tensions between the colonizers and colonial subjects kept brewing on the lands of Algeria until the Algerian Revolution, or the War with France, in 1954 and 1962. And this, in 1962, this war, or revolution, or conflict, or whatever you would like to describe it, finally won independence for Algeria. And this war is documented. A lot of prominent figures are write about this war: Frantz Fanon, Kitab Yassin, so on and so forth. So for many people, it also became the very archetype of the mid-20th century struggle to end Western colonialism. And it brings in the post-colonial period. This time frame is also a lot of when a lot of African countries are breaking away from the colonial rule and beginning achieving independence and going into the post-colonial period. So the war between the French military and the Algerian nationalists was one of the bloodiest in history. And see, not all conflicts in Africa ended so bloodily, as in North Africa either. There were, say, Italian colonialism in Libya did have some blood. The British in Egypt, say, didn't have much blood. So each case is different. And observers noted that the French-Algerian War unleashed a torrent of events with an astonishing and disturbing legacy. And we'll discuss that later. By the war's end, France's infant Fourth Republic had collapsed due to mismanagement, and which is Algeria. So here's what happened: this collapse and these negative effects of the colonial period, France ruling Algeria, and then the war. And then a lot of things break down, and we'll discuss it here. So Algeria's infrastructure was in complete ruins, and its institutions were inefficient in the post-colonial period after 1962, and probably overways, while an estimated 400,000 people had perished, which is a major demographic catastrophe for Algeria, which is relatively not that big of a population, 32 million, maybe more now, but I'm not 100% sure. So the war has had an enormous impact on French and Algerian cultural, political, social, and intellectual history. Violence such as torture, terrorism, and military actions had a serious impact on national communities. And more than any other colonial confrontation, the French-Algerian War forcibly demonstrated North Africa's impact on a major European power. The war in Algeria triggered a series of events that toppled the Fourth Republic, affected intellectual life, and destroyed long-standing myths about the universality of French culture. French culture is uniquely secular, so this is very interesting. So there is the common myths of universality were decayed about the French. So decolonization, let's discuss this a bit more. The decolonization of Algeria forced a fundamental reconsideration of politics, the status of intellectuals, and the role of French culture in the world in general, as we mentioned before. The legacy of decolonization is seldom effortlessly forgotten. Memory of the war will continue to pass from national history into national mythology. That is true. And the legacy of the war and decolonization reverberate in contemporary debates about historiography, language, ethnicity, immigration, gender relations, political ideology, morality, torture, violence, language, and religion, a lot of things. In the colonial and decolonial legacy in Algeria made it a weak state with frail state institutions, and these conditions were the precursor to conflict in Algeria, again, and we'll discuss this later, because Algeria is a very interesting and unique case. So Algeria's civil war. So it brews in the 90s after 1962 and Algeria's independence. So this is why it's a very unique conflict in Africa in a certain sense. So Algeria has suffered over 100,000 deaths and thousands more wounded in one of the modern history's most savage and incomprehensible civil wars, touched off by the military coup d'etat of January 1992, which put a sudden halt to the country's democratic process. It's even unique that Northern African countries in the 90s had some sort of a democratic process, but it's not a very robust one, and things decay. And even today, we'll discuss more of this later. It all started with a political crisis arising from the interruption of the elections in January 1992, which produced a dynamic of violence whose roots are to be sought in a war in which violence is a form of accumulation of wealth and prestige. The Civil War destroyed political machinery that ensured social control, and thus opened new ways for social progress through violence. And we'll discuss this later. The roots for conflict were planted after the riots in October 1998 in Algiers. President Chadli Benjedid organized a referendum on the constitution, which opened the way to multi-party politics in Algeria. In municipal elections in June 1989, the FIS won control of more than half the town housed and became the main political force. The Islamist Party, so the FIS is a Islamist party. So the Islamist party's ambition was to set up an Islamic state in Algeria. Its proposed policy worried a section of society and the military leaders who were afraid of becoming expiatory victims of an Islamic regime based on righteousness. This was a common theme in Egypt in 2013 in a certain sense, in 2012. Algerians no longer live in fear of being killed by radical Islamists at makeshift roadblocks or of being disappeared by ninjas. So this is what happened during the civil war in the early 90s, but now they no longer have this fear. And hooded policemen who break down front doors and take occupants away, never to return. So Algeria right now is more stable and in better shape than in the early 90s, which isn't saying much relatively, but this in itself is a remarkable achievement for a country that during the 1990s was synonymous with horrendous violence perpetrated both by Islamist radicals and by security forces. Algeria has regained stability with radical Islamists no longer a fundamental threat to society and security across the country. The country is also increasingly opening up to foreign investment. Algerians have enjoyed a period of peace and relative prosperity despite occasional flare-ups, and we'll get to that. During the presidency of Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who took office in 1999, Algeria has transitioned from civil war, state failure, and moral decay to stability. But recently there was a development. There might be kind of a late Arab Spring in countries like Algeria and Sudan for certain reasons. Or maybe not, we'll see. In 2019, Mr. Bouteflika stepped aside after mass protest, and the country now has the potential to maximize civil liberties and economic flourishing, even though the country still has a very long way to go. And we still don't know how Bouteflika's ouster will help or hurt the country. It's too early to tell, but we will have to wait and see. So we have two countries of expertise. We will be discussing Sudan. After this one, another North African country with a different colonial experience. This time, the British have a hand. So we'll look forward to the next one.